Welcome to the C Analysis Podcast. I'm your host, Chaz Nuttycombe, the director of C Analysis. Today, I am joined by Amanda Litman. She is a co-founder of Run for Something, a group that focuses on getting Democrats to run for offices up and down the ballot. Amanda, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
So tell us a little bit about your background. Why did you start Run for Something? And tell us more about what Run for Something is.
Sure. So I'm a campaign hack by trade. I got my start doing digital fundraising for Obama's reelect, then moved to Florida, did the governor's race there, moved to New York to work for Hillary Clinton with a couple stuff in between, and was devastated after our loss, just absolutely devastated. About a week after Election Day, I got a Facebook message from somebody I'd gone to college with. Hey, Amanda, I'm a public school teacher here in Chicago. I'm thinking about running for office because they keep cutting our budgets. And if Trump can be president, seems like fucking anybody can do this. What do I do? And at the time, I didn't have an answer for him because if you were young, in your mid-20s, early 30s, and you wanted to run for office for the first time, and you wanted to do more than vote and more than volunteer, there was nowhere you could go that would be guaranteed to take your call. And that to me felt like a symptom of some really big problems in the Democratic Party. So I reached out to a whole bunch of people with an idea. What if we started an organization that solved this problem? One of those became my co-founder, Ross Morales-Raquetto, who's worked in campaigns for about 15 years. And we wrote a plan and we built a website. And then we launched Run for Something on Inauguration Day over 4 years ago, thinking it would be really small. We figured we'd get 100 people who wanted to run in the first year, and this would be our side hustle. Instead, we had 1,000 people sign up in the first week. And as of today, we're up to more than 77,000 young people all across the country who've raised their hands to say they want to run for office. So we built a program that does just that recruits more people like them. And Run for Something only works with young people of 40 or younger, running for state legislature or local office for the first or second time. We only work with Democrats or progressives. And we help people go from thinking about running to all the way through Election Day and then what comes next after Election Day. And in our first 4 years, we've helped elect more than 500 people across 46 states, mostly women, mostly people of color, all under the age of 40 who are just remarkable. So it's been pretty cool.
Yeah, and I know one of the people you recruited in the 2017 cycle here in Virginia was Jennifer Carroll Foy, if I recall correctly. Or at least she was one of your endorsed candidates, and now she is running for governor. It's a long shot bid. Do you have anybody else from Virginia that is running statewide right now, or just Jennifer Carroll Foy?
Just Jennifer running statewide.
Okay.
We worked with Kasim in his state house race before he ran for Congress.
For who?
Kasim Rashid, who ran for state senate.
Okay.
Yeah. And ran for Congress. But we don't have anyone else running statewide in Virginia. We did work with Malcolm Kenyatta, who's now running for U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania. But I would expect over the next 2 to 4 years, we will have a number of congressional and statewide candidates as the folks who we helped elect in 2017, 2018, now that they have some grounding underneath them, get a chance to move up the ladder.
Okay. So I had Austin Chambers, who headed the RSLC last year, on our podcast not too long ago. He says the way the RSLC had such massive success last year was they focused on not flipping everything, but narrowing their targeting to states with redistricting. In hindsight, after the losses Democrats faced last year, do you think this is a good strategy for the Democrats to copy?
No. And I think that part of that is because the Republican Party is building off of 15 to 20 years of trying to flip everything. That may have been their strategy in 2020 to focus really intentionally on redistricting, but it's building on decades of deep investment in these state legislative races and in local infrastructure that the Democrats just haven't matched. So the way I've been explaining this to folks who don't really understand the context here is that the Republicans are on year 40 of their 40-year plan to build sustainable power, and Democrats are on year 5. We are at a different stage in this process, and we are deeply fucked by our failure to catch up with them, and it could get cut short. But I do think it's worth investing in flipping everywhere, in no small part because we have to move the needle from 70-30 to 60-40 to 55-45 in a lot of these districts. And that will not happen unless we at least compete. Now, I do think it's worth noting that the Republicans have also used their control of state legislatures to then make it harder for Democratic voters to show up at the polls. And we're seeing that now with the wave of voter suppression. So they've really privileged themselves into a system where between that and the redrawing of the maps, they don't have to try everywhere. We do. And that's because we didn't a decade ago. But it's not too late to make up ground.
Okay. So the reddest state legislative district in the country, held by a Democrat, voted for Trump by 67 points. It's in the coal fields in West Virginia. For the Republicans, the bluest state legislative district in the country, held by a Republican, voted for Biden by 62 points. It's a liberal ski town in Vermont. As polarization continues to increase, that range will continue to get shorter, just as it has through the 2010s. So what is the point for Democratic candidates running in districts redder than districts that Trump won by such margins, given that they virtually have no chance of winning unless they're in West Virginia? Because West Virginia Democrats will be able, on average, I think in 2020, their average overperformance over Trump margins were 20 points. So they're really the only exception here. But for outside of that state, what is the point?
Why not? I mean, it's a why not one? Why not try? I guess I would throw it back at you. Like, what is the harm? I think if we operate from a place of abundance, if we assume that there is, as always, more money to fund this work, because the amount of spending in election cycles keeps increasing year over year. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is sort of a separate conversation, but it's the reality of where we're at right now. There is always going to be enough money, or more money, rather, maybe not enough, but more. And even in a district where Trump won 67 points, that still means that there's 33% of Democratic voters there who deserve to have someone to vote.
Well, not 33%. He won it by 67 points. So it would be, that's the margin of victory. So
it still means there's Democratic voters there. No?
Right. I think it's double digits. So
double digits. Right. So there's Democratic voters there who deserve to have someone to show up at the polls. And I think we know that having state legislative candidates on the ballot helps increase Democratic performance at the top of the ticket. We did some research on this just a couple weeks ago, that simply contesting the entire slate of a state legislative district helps increase the top of ticket performance by anywhere from 0.3 to 1.5%. So maybe that Democratic candidate will lose by 67 points, but they could talk to 5 or 10 or 20 voters who could show up that maybe wouldn't have otherwise, not thinking that their vote mattered on the broader statewide or congressional scale, and help run up the score, even just a little bit. And I think it is really foolhardy to say that we should give up on places that we know we can't win, because that is a way to ensure we will never win them. But I really do. I get really frustrated with the argument that we shouldn't compete in places. We shouldn't contest elections. It's like, do you not believe in the premise of democracy? Do you not agree that we should give voters at least a chance? Do you think that talking to people and holding them accountable on the issues is a waste of time? You don't get a Senator John Ossoff in 2021 unless you had losing congressional candidate John Ossoff in 2017. Mm-hmm. It takes time. And losing sucks. And I don't want to pretend that there's anything like a moral victory in politics. But losing is part of the path to eventually winning. So I think it's worth doing always. And I think this is something that the Republican Party has done, at least in the past, historically, of trying to compete in places even when there isn't a shot, because you never know what kind of voters you'll find, and you never know what could happen to your opponent on the ballot. As I like to joke around, Republicans get indicted all the time, but the same is true sort of even in a primary. You just never know what's going to happen, so you might as well fill the ballot just in case.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely believe, the more districts that are contested by both parties, I think is better for democracy. It also makes it, more representative when you're looking at the data, for example, like the popular vote. It
Mm-hmm.
makes it more representative of what the actual results are.
That's exactly
But I think a great example, so in the Northeast, there are tons of state legislative districts that voted for Biden last year that had a Republican go uncontested. And a lot of people will say that, these Republicans would win no matter what. But so why do you think these districts in the Northeast that voted for Biden, um, but still did not have a Democratic candidate in the office, why do you think that is? And will your organization be targeting that region at all, or is it just not worth the time, given that most of the chambers in New England are pretty much certain Democratic holds?
Oh, I think it's absolutely worth the time. And we're going to be looking at all districts where they were previously uncontested, where Biden won the popular vote, but Republicans took the lower office. We're thinking holistically, and we try really hard to think about this, not by targeting for geography, but targeting for people. So where are there really good folks who are thinking about running for office, or where there's an opportunity to get someone really good into office? Can we help find someone who either wants to run or support that good person who wants to run? I think one of the things that Democrats have done, and this is more so on the congressional level, although we've shifted away from this a little bit, but it's true on state legislative level as well, is try to define our targets before we know what could be competitive. And it becomes tautological. You define your targets early, you invest money and recruitment into them, therefore they become competitive because the resources are there. When I think we need to approach it from the other way around. Start with as wide a funnel as possible, and try and empower as many people as we can, as many races as we can to rise to the top. It's a philosophical difference of the way to approach, at least at this point in the candidate recruitment cycle, how to think about it.
Okay. I know you talk a little bit about the theory of reverse coattails, but I'm not sure that I'm inclined to believe its existence across the board, given states where there are just massive ticket splits, especially, again, in Northeast. I think there can be an argument that it can work in some cases. Heck, I'd argue it existed here in Virginia in 2017.
Absolutely.
What sort of data do you have to back up the theory of reverse coattails? And do you agree that it's mostly circumstantial, or do you think it really is like all across the board?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about the study we did, because I think we're just at the early stages of research here. We are the first folks, as far as we know, to really invest in identifying whether this even exists. So there's a lot more research to do. What we did was measure, on the very pure definition, contested versus uncontested. Meaning, was both, most districts it's two, there's a House and a Senate, or two House and a Senate, or just a Senate. Whatever the state legislative slate was for that community, that precinct, did Democrats and Republicans fully contest it versus did Democrats leave it empty? And what we found is that no matter how you sliced it, whether you looked at Target Smart data, which is like an algorithm and modeling, or Clinton performance, which was clear partisanship lines or clearer partisanship lines, there was a positive impact. Simply fielding state legislative candidates led to a positive anywhere from 0.3 to 1.5% increase on the top of the ticket. And we looked at this across a variety of states and districts. We actually focused specifically on this data in Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, Arizona, Georgia, Texas, and then Kansas and New York. And we chose these places, one, because they're reflective of traditional battlegrounds and emerging battlegrounds. New York and Kansas, obviously the top of the ticket isn't that competitive in those places for differing directions. There are also places where we could get really clear data, which I think is a tough, anyone who's tried to dig through precinct data can be very tricky. And those were also places where there was enough contested versus uncontested elections. And I think our theory here, and what we had found in previous sort of less formal ways of measuring this, is that in places where the top of ticket is slightly less competitive, it has an even bigger impact. So it can help close the margins a little bit. But no matter how you slice it, it is clear that contesting these state legislative elections has a positive drive on performance. And I think it makes sense if you think about state leg candidates being supercharged field organizers who are running localized campaigns, talking to voters about our values in a lens that connects with them in a meaningful way. And I will say, candidly, I find that most of the time state leg candidates are way more interesting and way more personable and way more genuine in a lot of ways than some of our higher office candidates, in part because the stakes are a little bit lower. They're more compelling and they give people a reason to show up, and they drive conversation in places where the top of the ticket probably isn't. I think a lot about states like Pennsylvania, in which Biden's plan for victory and the places he needed to organize and the place where we needed to organize to flip state house seats only barely overlapped. Same is true in Texas or in Georgia. These are just different imperatives that they're working towards. So it's worth fielding everywhere because you can't count on a national campaign to organize everywhere.
Okay. So going back to my interview with Austin Chambers here, I mentioned to him how there are many more Biden Republican districts than there are Trump Democratic districts on the state legislative level. And I asked him why that is. I'd like for you to answer the same question here.
Why there are more Biden districts that are held by Republicans. Is that right?
Yeah, why there are more Biden districts that are held by Republicans than there are Trump districts held by Democrats?
I would say the drawing of maps certainly plays a role here. And, we talk about gerrymandering usually in the congressional sense, but it happens, as you well know, on the state legislative sense as well. So these maps are in many places rigged to empower a Republican candidate to win. So that's certainly one reason, although it probably does not explain all of them. I also think that there are a lot of Republican voters who did not like Trump and felt Joe Biden was amenable, but did not agree with that down ticket, which is a reasonable place to fall. But I think that gives Democrats an opportunity to sort of weasel our way in. Like voting for Joe Biden this time around was the gateway to being a Democrat, if not quite all the way there.
Okay. So in 2020, obviously for the Democrats, money was not scarce. We'll see if that continues to be the case going into 2021 and the midterm. But do you think there's such thing as over investment in a race when it comes to especially those that aren't really competitive?
No, I think there's such a thing as late investment in a race. What we have seen in some now retrospective stuff is that in some Texas, Arizona, North Carolina, in particular, state legislative candidates, they were getting upwards of 50% of their budget in the final 2 weeks of the campaign or final month in some places. There is no such thing as too much money. There is such thing as too much money too late. If a lot of that money had come in 6 months earlier, 8 months earlier, a year earlier, it could have been used more efficiently, more effectively, and ultimately probably towards a better electoral outcome. You can certainly allocate resources based on competitiveness over time, but the fact of the matter is that flipping seats takes money early because it means you have to knock those doors, run those ads, redo the research, hire the staff, which is one of those things we don't talk about enough, but it actually does take a long time, and to onboard staff and then get them up and running. Like, you can't hire a new field director with 2 weeks left to go in the campaign. And we know that the TV ads, at a certain point, you do reach marginal increases in performance on TV ads. The same is not necessarily true with canvassing and with door-to-door contact, with personal contact. So I don't think there's such thing as too much. I do think there's such a thing as too much too late, is the short way of answering that.
Okay. Well, so yeah, on the state legislative level, but for example, Amy McGrath in Kentucky, do you think there really should have been that much money put into her campaign? We're talking on the federal level, I guess. Would you agree that that would be an overinvestment at all? Especially because, you look at the down ballot level,
yeah.
Democrats got wiped on the state legislative level, and she was running these terrible ads. If there's anything with the existence of negative coattails, she had them.
I'm glad you differentiated. I think on state ledge, it was too little, too late, or too late. I think especially with some of these top tier Senate races or top fundraising Senate races, I don't think you should write anywhere off. And I don't think the way we're going to flip a state is by starting with the Senate, starting with the statewide. That's just, it's not how these things, it's not how people work. So yeah, if I was a billionaire, would I have put all my money into Amy McGrath? No, but I think it's hard when you have, this is the downside, maybe not downside, but this is one of the challenges of so much funding now being driven by grassroots donors is it is emotional, it is not always strategic. And we have to factor that in. I think people who do strategic giving have to factor in that emotional outpour into what they invest in.
Okay. So you mentioned about not starting with the statewide first when it comes to flipping these state legislative districts. The Republican nominee, Glenn Youngkin, has promised to use his financial resources to not just help his campaign, but the down ballot candidates as well. The Democrats are extremely likely, if not pretty much certain, to nominate Terry McAuliffe for governor here in Virginia. Well, I'm talking about Virginia here. But I don't know that he has made that same type of pledge as Glenn Youngkin. Do you think that Youngkin's pledge to use his wealth, not just help his campaign, but the down ballot candidates as well in Virginia, especially because, the Virginia Republicans have lost the money race. They lost it in 2019, lost it in 2020, lost it in some districts 2017. Do you think that is going to pay off for the Republicans in Virginia, that strategy?
I hope not, but you never know. And it's one of the reasons why I hope Democrats don't sit on our laurels and assume that this is a safe race. Once you win, you have to that win. I think Youngkin being able to self-fund in a lot of ways and to personally fund a lot of these down ballot Republicans is really scary. But I do think that Virginia Democrats have done a pretty good job of doing sustained work. It's one of the few benefits of basically elections every year is you have a reason to keep knocking doors or making calls or doing whatever made sense during the pandemic. So I hope not, but it is the thing that definitely should frighten the shit out of Democrats who are thinking about the progress we've made over the last 4 years or last 3 with the trifecta, I guess 2 with the trifecta, and how important it is not to give up now that we've got the win.
All right. Amanda Litman, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have anything to plug? Your or organization website, maybe, for people who are listening and may be thinking of running for office?
Yeah. If you are listening to this podcast, you are exactly the kind of person we need running for office, and Run for Something would love to help you. So if you go to runforsomething.net, you can learn more about our support program and our candidates. You can see all the folks we're working with this year. We also have the Run for Something podcast, which includes me talking to a bunch of candidates. It includes our very first episode was with Jennifer Carroll Foy, currently running for governor. Next, coming up soon is Jennifer Kitchen, candidate for Virginia State House. And we'll have some other Virginia candidates over the summer and into the fall. It's my home state. It's where I'm from. So I love talking to Virginians. So go to the website and listen to the show.